Jean Froissart, the Hainaut chronicler, who's our main source, primary source, he records that there was an actual encounter between Douglas and Percy outside the wooden barbican or barrier at Newcastle. The two knights charged at each other, and Douglas made off with Percy's pennon. It's a bit bad form for Percy. It was a bit humiliating that he had lost his pennon. And the story was that the Battle of Otterburn came about because Percy was determined to recover his pennon. That's bollocks. Neither Douglas nor Percy would be too bothered about a pennon, and both were too much seasoned campaigners. Hotspur was 25 at the time, but he'd started his military apprenticeship in France at 9, and he killed his first man at 12. So he knew what he was doing. Percy was given the name Hotspur, not by the English, but by the Scots, because of his speed of response, because of the pace he could move at and strike like lightning in these Scottish raids. What he'd never done was lead an army in battle. Big difference between fighting a quick-moving guerrilla action and committing forces to a significant pitched battle. The Scots withdrew from Newcastle, taking up Ponteland, taking the Castellan of Ponteland hostage. They retreated, not up the current A696, but over the old road through Harwood until they came past Elsdon, and then they reached Otterburn, which is about 10 miles south of the border being pretty much then as it is now, where they laid siege to Otterburn Tower, which is now the Otterburn Towers Hotel, actually on the market. It can be also 2.5 million if you fancy. And that was held by the Umfravilles, who again were lords of Reed, still a powerful Marcher family. Percy set off after them. So the battle is fought, depending on which sources you believe, on the 5th of August, which is really the Scottish view, on the 19th of August, the English view. Evidence probably now favours the Scottish view. It was early in August. So, and the battle takes place actually in the evening, the twilight of the 5th. And it's light till about 9 o'clock in Northumberland at that time. And it was a fine day. But Percy had set off that at noon with his whole force to follow the Scots up toward Otterburn. That's a distance of nearly 30 miles, which he covered in 6 hours. Now, of course, medieval armies didn't actually march in the sense of foot slogging. They rode horses. They might fight on foot, but they'd ride their light horses. Even so, that's still quite a feat to drag a force of somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 men up 30 miles of exceedingly bad road to confront an enemy at twilight. So Percy's column passed Elsdon probably at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and would have been approaching Otterburn at around 6 o'clock, about an hour later. About 3 hours of daylight left. There is always a story that the battle was fought in the dark by moonlight. That is not correct. It was fought in what would be late evening, but still pretty effective daylight for about 3 hours, maybe a bit more on a fine day. Problem was, as Douglas passed Otterburn Castle, he didn't exactly know where the Scots were. That's the problem with a lightning attack. You lack intelligence. You do not know exactly where the enemy is located or whether he's expecting you. Dunbar was not expecting Percy. For once, Dunbar was wrong-footed, but he had prepared for this contingency. He and Douglas had split the Scottish force. The commoners, the servants, those of the lower sort, were lower down a ridge of high ground which stands due north, about a mile or so north of the settlement of Otterburn. This runs down from an old Iron Age camp, the Greenchesters, down toward the River Reed. Now, the Reed's changed its course slightly, but not significantly, and the area around, the living area around it, was wet and marshy. On the other hand, of course, all these captured cattle, there'll be hundreds of captured beasts, captured horses, and the Scots' own horses, as they also would also ride, needed water, which of course is an important resource. So the lower Scottish camp held all of the mobile booty and was guarded by effectively light infantry, armed servants, etc. Whereas the higher camp, obviously those the higher in the rank, the higher camp, not far from the old Iron Age encampment, that camp contained the Scottish men-at-arms. And exactly which numbers were in each camp is hard to say. It's all largely speculation because Froissart never saw the ground and his accounts don't actually tally. However, from the Scottish main position on the higher ground, there's a very good view down towards Otterburn. You can see the ground pretty plainly. And you can see any enemy that's advancing across it. What Hotspur did not appreciate, but which Dunbar did appreciate, because he had 3 days of camping there to practice, was that there was a re-entrant which led down from the higher Scottish position, which would be obscured from any force advancing along the valley bottom by a very slight ridge, which had scrub and trees, and it was possible to move men on what would be the north side of the ridge and would to enfilade any force which was coming straight at you. Hotspur hadn't quite got that because he hadn't been at the wrecking the ground thoroughly enough. However, he arrives, therefore, let's say 6 o'clock, with the empty plain before him. Pretty good idea where the Scots are. He knows there's at least one camp by the riverside, and he knows there will be another camp higher up. The Scots will not commit their full force to such a low-lying position. He will appreciate he now has advantage of numbers. He probably outnumbers the Scots by 2 to 1. But if you think about it, you have a column, if you have a mounted column comprising 7,000 men on medieval roads, they're probably strung out over 10 miles of a lot of ground, even a fast-moving column without logistical tail. A lot of stragglers, a lot of people will drop behind in the dash from Newcastle. So deploying your men fully over that ground at that time is pretty tricky. A lot of Hotspur's force were, of course, archers, longbowmen. And he had 2 choices. He could attack now, but really couldn't deploy his longbowmen because he didn't have a target. Or he could wait till the morning and tempt the Scots out to a pitched battle. However, Hotspur knew if he waited, if he made camp at Otterburn, then Dunbar would use the darkness to withdraw. He'd withdraw north. Scots were very good at this. He would withdraw north into the rough country, extremely wild country, north of Otterburn, leading to the border, and the chances of the English catching them were probably fairly slim. Certainly catching them on ground which favoured the English. Hotspur then decided to divide his forces. Remember the classic dictum, march divided, fight united. Well, a bit like Custer, he did exactly the opposite. He split his force. 2 of his senior officers, Sir Matthew Redmayne and Sir James Ogle, would lead a left flank attack direct toward this lower Scottish camp. So they would march parallel to the river and barrel in a full front, nothing subtle, just smash into the Scottish camp and endeavour, obviously, to destroy that wing of the Scottish army. Hotspur thought that must tempt the Scots, the rest of the army, to come down from wherever they were. So he took command with his brother Ralph of the right-hand column, which would be the stronger, and advanced on a parallel basis, but perhaps a bit more slowly. Redmayne and Ogle, we know, almost certainly went ahead more rapidly, and indeed smashed into the Scottish camp. The Scots had guarded their camp, the chevaux de frise, fallen logs, and various obstacles, and a fight developed as the English attempted to break in. Dunbar, appreciating the situation with the camp, sent, I can see from the map here, he sent 200 men-at-arms down from the main camp to reinforce the lower camp and to enable them to hold on, whilst he deployed his men for a flank attack using the dead ground to come upon, as he hoped, Hotspur's men unexpectedly. It's still broad daylight, so the lack of light is not a feature in this. Ogle and Redmayne achieved success. They broke into the camp, and notwithstanding the reinforcement, the Scots in the camp, after a pretty stiff fight, broke and ran, grabbed whatever horses they could, and disappeared in the general direction of Scotland. Redmayne and Ogle, a bit like Rupert's cavalry at Naseby, instead of reforming, they went after them. Obviously, there was a fair bit of loot to be liberated from the camp, but that wing of the English army began to pursue the defeated wing of the Scottish army. And that pursuit continued for 5 miles, almost as far as the border. So although Redmayne and Ogle had achieved success, they had actually thrown that away with their failure to rally their men, leaving Hotspur exposed. Now, on the one hand, Hotspur might have not been too worried because his flank was still protected by the reed. However, at that moment, Dunbar's flank attack, led by Douglas, the Earl of Douglas, smashes into Hotspur's column. Exactly what numbers are involved, we don't really know, but they were probably not far off being even. Douglas, we know, in his hurry to get into the fight, leaves his helmet off, which is most unwise for a medieval knight. Indeed, it was about to cost him dear. The English, however, now fighting dismounted, recovered from the shock and managed to hold their line. So they managed to hold their line against the Scots, and a fierce fight, an infantry fight, develops on this section of the battlefield, which probably goes on with the usual hots for at least an hour. Now, Dunbar, at that point, realizes that the fight hangs in the balance, and he then deploys his last reserve. He gives his last reserve to Douglas, tells him to outflank the English line and throw everything into that flank attack. Douglas obliges. This second attack begins to fracture the English line. Douglas, with his true berserker spirit, launches himself into the English. He's actually cut down and killed, dies of his wounds, but nobody actually sees him go down in the melee. The melee is now fierce, of course, and will have broken up into knots of fighting men. Bear in mind that the key factor is the English, of course, have been in the saddle or on the march for most of the day. They will be tired long before they got to Otterburn, whereas the Scots are fed, fresh, and rested. In what is now the gloaming, the English line begins to break up. Hotspur and his brother Ralph are captured. Rafe is so badly wounded that the blood is pouring out of the greaves of his armour. And in fact, he's actually released on parole because the Scots don't think he'll survive. Hotspur, fighting bravely as ever, is captured, and the English withdraw. This is not a rout. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of a rout. The surviving English withdraw from the field and march off back towards Elsdon, which is about 3 miles to the south of them. Elsdon being the capital town of Redesdale at that point. And the Scots are left in possession of the field. There doesn't actually seem to be much of a pursuit. Both sides would be utterly exhausted by this point. There is no clear information on casualties. Some say the English lost 1,000, the Scots a few hundred. Others think that the casualties were probably fairly even at around 500 each. Certainly neither side has any appetite to renew the fight. After all, Dunbar hasn't been looking for a fight. To win a pitched battle against the English is really quite a revelation. He's done damn well on this. He's lost Douglas, but he didn't like Douglas anyway. The Dunbars and Douglases do not get on. And therefore, for him, that's a bit of a bonus, really. The English are reinforced the next day by the Bishop of Durham, coming up with a relief force. But the bishop doesn't quite have the nerve to renew the attack. And the Scots, therefore, are left to collect their dead, collect whatever loot they can, and continue their withdrawal. Oban and Redmond have reformed their men, and we don't know quite what route they took, but they obviously bypassed the Scottish army. There's no further fight. And both sides then withdraw, and the battle is over, apart from the boundary. The battle is undoubtedly a tactical victory for the Scots. It has a galvanic effect on the course of the war. Richard II and the English nobility are horrified that an English army has actually been defeated in open field by an inferior, in terms of numbers, inferior Scottish force. And in a way, having said that, it doesn't do the Percys any harm. Hotspur's ransom is 7,000 marks, which is around $500,000 in today's money, which is effectively crowd-funded. And he's released very quickly. Most English prisoners are, the nobles are ransomed pretty soon after the battle is over. And Hotspur suffers no fallout from the fact that he's been defeated. Now, one of the questions which always dominates archaeological thinking, battlefield archaeology, is where are the dead buried? And all the battlefield archaeologists I know have spent an awful lot of time searching for mass graves, which by and large they never find. Otterburn may be different. Otterburn Church, St. Cuthbert's, is an ancient church. It was founded, as the name would suggest, it was one of the resting places for Cuthbert's coffin when he was travelling south to avoid the attentions of our Scandinavian brethren. In the 19th century, the stone flagged floor of the nave was dug up to facilitate improvements. And beneath were found what was said to be the skeletons of 1,000 or thereabouts young men. Many of those skeletons, it was said, bore evidence of battle damage. Now, of course, there has been no DNA testing, there's no forensic work. The local doctor, who had been a military surgeon, was called to examine the remains and did. A pretty comprehensive report, insofar as the resources of the time would allow. He concluded that the skeletons were all male, that they were mainly young, between 18 and 45, and that indeed quite a number of them appear to have died violently. They were robust physical specimens. He then had all of these bones reburied in a mass grave just outside the north wall of the nave, where they rest to this day. And there is a major project, an ecological and historical project called Revitalising Reestill, funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund, run by the Northumberland National Park Authority, which is carrying out significant work on the battlefield. There's been battlefield archaeology, which amazingly enough has found nothing. And there will be a visitor centre built in due course. The battlefield monument erected in the 18th century is getting a makeover. But what we'd really like to do is to get a faculty from the church to excavate the mass grave. I'm sure people will remember the astonishing results from the mass grave at Taunton in the 90s, and also from the mass grave of prisoners from the Battle of Dunbar in Durham, which was opened in 2013. And of course, ancient bones now with modern DNA analysis can tell us an awful lot about the people who were there. We can speculate at the moment that these are the bones of the men who died at Otterburn. St Cuthbert's was the only consecrated ground at that time. Otterburn didn't have a church. And it would not have been unusual for both sides to agree to a truce to remove their dead from the battlefield. So my money, for what it's worth, is that this is actually a mass grave from medieval warfare. And there are very few of those who have any idea where they might be. Obviously, Taunton was a very lucky find. Big battles, there's been nothing else found at Taunton, even Flodden, which had 10,000 dead. There's been no trace of the mass graves discovered. As an epilogue on the battle, in 1986, I and a small team were summoned by the Ministry of Defence 5 miles north of Otterburn at a place called Sillowens, where actually now is one of the best preserved World War I trench networks in Britain, where the MOD had been clearing the ground, looking obviously for unexploded munitions, and had discovered an anomaly. Their recorders showed something in the ground, but clearly wasn't munitions. So they assumed it was something of archaeological interest, pegged out the site and asked us to investigate, which we did. And we found a sword called the Sillowens sword. The sword's not in particularly good condition. It's now in the officers' mess at Reesdale Camp. There we just had a full-scale replica made, which will be going up in Elsdon Church. And when I looked at the sword, at the fragments, I dated it. Its date of manufacture to around 12, say the last quarter of the 13th century. That's 100 years before Otterburn. Now, I've always speculated, and I can't possibly prove it, that this was booty from the Battle of Otterburn, dropped by the Scots probably in their precipitate retreat, because that's the route that the Scottish camp followers would have adopted had they been heading back to Scotland in a hurry, and that it became lost and was simply forgotten about. Because the sword was a high-value item, this was a high-value sword. And of course, swords were handed down from father to son, and it's therefore by no means impossible that a sword that was a century old was still being used by combatants at that particular time. So I like to say that sword is a survivor from the Battle of Otterburn. The Scottish hegemony, therefore, continued until 1400, until the reign of Henry IV, when George Dunbar, the Earl of March, changed sides. He defected from Scotland after a dispute with the new Earl of Douglas and came to serve the English. He advised Hotspur on his next big battle against the Scots, which was Homildon in September 1402. Homildon turned out to be the most perfect ever longbow victory. About 2,000 Scots were killed in the battle, another 500 drowned, 1,000 were taken prisoner, and as far as is known, the English suffered no casualties at all. There would have been some, but certainly there are no recorded casualties. The longbow punished the dense packed ranks of Scottish Sultans with such savagery that the Scottish army broke without ever coming into contact. Dunbar then changed sides again. He went to serve Henry IV, because by this time Hotspur had rebelled against Henry IV and met a traitor's death in his third and final battle at Shrewsbury, where King Henry was strongly advised by Dunbar, and Dunbar, along with the Prince Hal, has got the credit for winning the Battle of Shrewsbury.